It was supposed to be just another day, but for young Lisa, it turned into a nightmare. Falsely accused, humiliated, and left to face the harshness of prejudice, she had no one on her side until her father took a stand. What happens next will leave you speechless. Watch till the end to see how this incredible journey unfolds, and if you were in her place, what would you do? Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Lisa, an 11-year-old girl, was filled with excitement as she entered her father's jewelry store after school. She was a small girl, bright-eyed and curious, and the store always felt like stepping into a fairy tale. The showcases sparkled under the lights, the gems glimmered like stars, and each display seemed to hold secrets waiting to be discovered. Her father's store was her sanctuary, a place where she could wander freely and marvel at the luxurious pieces. To her, every visit was like a new adventure, where beauty and elegance surrounded her. Today was no different. Lisa's eyes sparkled with wonder as she strolled down the rows of glass cases, letting her fingers lightly trace along the cool glass surfaces. She moved slowly, her eyes capturing every detail of the beautiful jewelry laid out before her. Necklaces with shimmering gemstones, rings that caught the light just right, and earrings that seemed to twinkle with a life of their own. Each piece seemed to have its own story, and she loved to imagine the people who might wear them and the lives they led. Usually, her father was here in the store, working in his office and checking on his employees, but today he had stepped out for an important meeting. She didn't mind. She was used to wandering the showroom alone, lost in her daydreams. Her father always trusted her around the displays, knowing she had respect for the delicate and valuable items. And though he had always reminded her to be careful, Lisa had never caused any trouble here. As she walked along one of the aisles, her attention was drawn to a particularly beautiful pair of diamond earrings. They were small and delicate, shimmering under the display lights like tiny stars. She leaned in closer, captivated by their subtle glow and perfect craftsmanship. They were the kind of earrings that looked as though they belonged in a storybook, a treasure meant for a princess. For a moment, she imagined herself wearing them, looking elegant and sophisticated, just like the glamorous women she sometimes saw on the city's bustling streets. Lost in her thoughts, Lisa moved a little closer to the glass case, wanting to get a better look. She pressed her small fingers lightly against the edge of the display and, without meaning to, nudged the delicate stand holding one of the earrings. Before she could react, the tiny piece of jewelry slipped from its place, fell to the shelf, and tumbled to the floor with a soft clink. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the earring on the floor. Panic gripped her for a moment, and she knelt down quickly, her hands shaking as she reached out to pick it up. She hadn't meant for this to happen. It was a pure accident, nothing more. She knew she should be more careful and began mentally rehearsing how she would explain this to her father. Before her trembling fingers could even touch the fallen earring, a sharp, harsh voice broke the silence. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice was cold and accusing, sending a chill through Lisa's entire body. Startled, she looked up to see Miss Gray, the new salesperson, towering over her with a severe expression on her face. Miss Gray was tall, with sharp features and an air of disapproval that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Lisa had seen her a few times before, but had never actually spoken to her. Something about Miss Gray's demeanor had always made her feel uneasy, like she was being judged simply for existing in the same space. Now, Miss Gray's face was twisted in a mixture of suspicion and anger, her gaze fixed on Lisa like she had just caught her in a terrible act. "I'm sorry," Lisa stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to drop it." Miss Gray's eyes narrowed and her mouth twisted into a scornful sneer. "Didn't mean to drop it? Or didn't mean to steal it?" Her voice dripped with accusation, the words laced with a cold disdain that made Lisa's skin crawl. Lisa's heart raced and she shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, I wasn't trying to steal it. It was just an accident, I swear." But Miss Gray didn't seem to be listening. Her gaze was filled with contempt as she looked down at Lisa, a look that spoke of deep-rooted resentment and disdain. She took a step closer, her tall figure towering over the young girl, making her feel small and vulnerable. "I knew it the moment I saw you in here," Miss Gray hissed, her voice low and menacing. "People like you don't belong in a place like this. You thought you could just come in here and take whatever you wanted, didn't you?" Lisa's voice trembled as she tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She had never felt so helpless, so small. The accusation cut through her like a knife. She wasn't a thief, she was just a little girl admiring her father's store. The fact that Miss Gray thought of her as anything else left her feeling confused and hurt. "No, please," she managed to whisper, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to." Her words were cut off by a sudden, sharp slap across her face. The sound echoed through the quiet store, and Lisa stumbled backward, clutching her cheek in shock. The force of the blow sent her reeling, and she fell to the floor, her back hitting the cold, hard surface. For a moment, she lay there, stunned, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at Miss Gray, who stood over her, breathing heavily, her hand still raised, a satisfied glint in her eyes. Lisa's small body trembled as she whimpered in pain and fear. Her cheek stung from the slap, her heart pounded wildly, and every instinct screamed at her to get up and run, to escape from this nightmare. But she was frozen in place, overwhelmed by the fear that had seized her. Miss Gray leaned down, her face twisted in a cruel smile as she whispered in a voice only Lisa could hear. "You're nothing but a little thief, and thieves get what they deserve." Before Lisa could respond, Miss Gray straightened up, pulling out her phone. She dialed a number, her voice suddenly calm and composed as she spoke into the receiver. "Yes, I'd like to report an attempted theft at the jewelry store," she said smoothly. "We have a young girl here, caught red-handed trying to steal a diamond earring. Please send someone immediately." As she listened to the response on the other end of the line, Miss Gray's eyes flicked back to Lisa, her gaze cold and unfeeling. Lisa's heart sank. She couldn't believe this was happening. She hadn't done anything wrong. It had been an accident, nothing more. But Miss Gray seemed deaf to her pleas, and the police were already on their way. Lisa tried to sit up, her small hands gripping her knees as she hugged them to her chest, her body racked with quiet sobs. The store, her father's store, had always felt safe. But now it was a place of terror, a place where she was being treated like a criminal. The shimmering displays, once filled with beauty, now seemed cold and unforgiving. She looked up at Miss Gray, hoping for some glimmer of compassion, but the woman's face was set in stone, her eyes hard and unyielding. "Please," Lisa whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. "It was just an accident. I didn't mean to." But Miss Gray's response was a harsh, biting silence. Her voice was sharp, final, as if there was nothing more to be said, no truth to be heard. "The police will handle you," she said, a cold smirk on her lips. And so, Lisa sat there on the cold floor of the store, her hands trembling, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. She had never felt so alone, so misunderstood. She could hear the distant wail of sirens approaching, the sound growing louder with each passing second. As the moments dragged on, the little girl could do nothing but wait, her body trembling and her heart heavy with a dread she had never known before. The silence in the jewelry store was shattered by the shrill sound of police sirens drawing closer. Lisa, still sitting on the cold floor with her knees pulled tightly to her chest, felt a chill of terror settle deep inside her as the sound grew louder. Her cheek still stung from Miss Gray's slap, her body ached from the fall, and her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Miss Gray stood nearby, arms folded, a smirk of satisfaction twisting her lips as she watched Lisa. The woman's eyes were cold, unfeeling, as if Lisa were an object, not a child. The once friendly store that Lisa had seen as a place of wonder now felt like a prison, with Miss Gray as her cruel jailer. The door burst open as two police officers entered, their expressions stern and unyielding. They were both tall, imposing figures whose presence filled the room with a sense of intimidation. Without sparing a moment to ask questions, they turned to Miss Gray, who wasted no time stepping forward to give her version of events. "There she is," Miss Gray said, her voice laced with disdain as she gestured toward Lisa. "I caught her trying to steal a diamond earring. She was acting suspicious, sneaking around, and when I confronted her, she became defensive. I had no choice but to call you." The officers glanced at Lisa, who sat trembling on the floor, her wide eyes red and teary, but if they saw her distress, they didn't show any sympathy. Instead, they turned back to Miss Gray, nodding as though they were already convinced of the little girl's guilt. One of the officers stepped toward Lisa, his face expressionless, yet his tone edged with hostility. "Is this true, young lady?" he demanded, looking down at her as though she were a hardened criminal. "Were you trying to steal something?" Lisa's heart pounded, and she quickly shook her head, her voice shaky and barely audible. No, I wasn't. I just dropped it. It was an accident." The officer's gaze didn't soften. Instead, he exchanged a glance with his partner, who seemed equally unmoved by her plea. "Stand up," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lisa tried to get to her feet, but her legs felt weak, and her body trembled uncontrollably. The other officer reached down, grabbing her arm with a roughness that took her breath away. She gasped as he hauled her to her feet, the pressure of his grip bruising her small arm. The pain and fear made her feel faint, and she could barely stand as the officer's grip held her in place. "Please," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I didn't do anything wrong." But her words seemed to bounce off them like they were nothing more than background noise. Ignoring her plea, the officer roughly twisted her arms behind her back and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Before Lisa even knew what was happening, cold metal snapped around her wrists, binding them together. The tightness was excruciating, the metal biting into her skin, leaving angry red marks. Her heart raced as she looked up at the officers, her teary eyes filled with disbelief. This couldn't be real. She was in her father's store, a place where she'd always felt safe, and now she was being treated like a criminal. All because of an accident. Miss Gray watched the scene unfold with a satisfied smirk, her gaze unwavering as the officers roughly led Lisa toward the door. "Make sure you take her away," she sneered. "We don't need people like her in a place like this." Lisa's stomach churned at the woman's words. She didn't understand what Miss Gray meant by people like her, but the venom in the woman's voice made her feel even smaller, more helpless. She struggled against the officer's iron grip, trying to explain one last time. "Please, you have to believe me," she cried, her voice barely a whisper. "It was an accident. I didn't steal anything." One of the officers scoffed, tightening his hold on her arm as he led her toward the police car parked just outside. "Save it for the station," he said coldly, not even glancing back at her. The harshness of his tone cut through her like a knife. Lisa could feel the eyes of passers-by on her as she was pushed out onto the sidewalk, a small, trembling girl surrounded by two towering officers. The shame and humiliation of it made her heart ache, and she looked down, too afraid to meet anyone's gaze. She could feel the stares of curious strangers, could hear their murmurs, but all she wanted to do was disappear, to escape from this nightmare that she couldn't seem to wake up from. As they reached the police car, one of the officers opened the door and roughly pushed her inside. She stumbled forward, her knees hitting the hard seat painfully as she tried to steady herself. The door slammed shut behind her with a force that echoed in the enclosed space, and she was left alone in the back seat, her hands cuffed, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The car smelled of stale leather and metal, a cold, impersonal scent that filled her with a sense of dread. She pressed herself into the corner of the seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her cheeks were wet with tears, her wrists throbbed from the tightness of the cuffs, and every inch of her body ached from the rough treatment she'd endured. Through the window, she could see Miss Gray watching with a twisted smile on her face, her arms crossed as she observed the scene with a look of satisfaction. It was as if she took pleasure in watching Lisa suffer and seeing her dragged away like a criminal. Lisa's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had never been in trouble before, had never even been close to anything like this. And now she was being taken away, treated as if she had done something unforgivable. The police car's engine roared to life and the vehicle began to move, pulling her farther and farther away from the store, from the life she knew. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and a wave of panic crashed over her. She felt like she couldn't breathe, her chest tightening with each passing second. The police officers in the front seat didn't speak to her, didn't acknowledge her fear. She was nothing to them, just another troublemaker to deal with. As they drove, Lisa pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the city streets blur by. Every familiar sight now seemed strange and distant, like she was looking at it from another world. The sounds, the colors, the people, they all felt like they belonged to someone else's life, not hers. Her own life had been ripped away in an instant, replaced by this terrifying reality where she was treated as less than human. They soon arrived at the police station, a looming building that seemed to cast a shadow over everything around it. The officers exited the car, and one of them opened the back door, grabbing her arm with the same roughness as before. Lisa stumbled as she was yanked out, her small legs struggling to keep up with their long strides. Inside, the station was cold and unfriendly. The officers led her through a series of hallways, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a harsh glow that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. She could feel the stares of other officers, each gaze filled with judgment and suspicion. She didn't belong here. She was just a child who had made a mistake, nothing more. But no one seemed to care. They brought her to a small, sterile room and sat her down in a metal chair, her wrists still bound in the unforgiven handcuffs. The officers exchanged a few words outside, speaking in low tones, and then one of them re-entered the room, standing over her with a stern expression. "Now," he said, his voice cold and unfeeling, "do you want to tell us the truth?" Lisa looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. She wanted to tell him everything, to explain how it had all been a mistake, but the words caught in her throat. She could barely think, barely breathe. Every time she tried to speak, the memory of Miss Gray's slap and the officer's rough hands on her arms flashed through her mind, silencing her with a wave of fear. I didn't, she managed to stammer, her voice shaking. I didn't steal anything. The officer shook his head, his face a mask of disappointment. I don't want to hear excuses. We know what you did. You were caught in the act. Lisa's heart sank. She realized then that nothing she said would change their minds. They had already decided who she was and what she had done. Her pleas, her innocence, they didn't matter to them. She lowered her head, her shoulders trembling as silent tears fell onto her lap. The officer watched her for a moment, then stepped out of the room, leaving her alone in the cold, empty silence. Lisa sat there, her body tense, her mind racing. She didn't know how long she sat in that room, but every minute felt like an eternity. She thought of her father, hoping he would come and save her, hoping that somehow this nightmare would end. But as the hours passed, the fear remained, settling deep within her, a constant reminder of the terrible reality she was trapped in. The sterile silence of the police station was broken by the sudden sound of footsteps approaching. Lisa, still sitting alone in the cold, dim room, barely registered it, her body numb and her mind clouded by exhaustion and fear. Her wrists throbbed from the handcuffs that had left dark red marks, and her cheeks stung from Miss Gray's slap. The memories of the rough treatment she'd endured played over and over in her mind, each moment searing her with a new wave of shame and helplessness. The door opened, and two officers entered. Their faces were stern, their expressions unreadable. They exchanged a quick glance before one of them gestured for her to stand. "On your feet," he said, his tone clipped and cold. He looked down at her with an air of authority as if she was already guilty in his eyes. Lisa struggled to her feet, her legs weak and shaky. She had no strength left to protest, no words that could convince them of her innocence. She tried to explain, to tell them the truth, but they had ignored her every word. She felt invisible, like her voice didn't matter, like she didn't matter. "Let's go," the officer said, gripping her arm tightly. He led her out of the room, his grip firm, almost painful, and she was forced to keep pace with him as they moved through the station's narrow hallways. As they walked, they passed other officers who cast curious glances her way, some of them murmuring under their breath, others simply watching in silence. Each stare felt like another accusation, another silent judgment. Lisa's face flushed with embarrassment, and she kept her head down, trying to avoid the eyes that seemed to follow her every step. The officer stopped at a counter near the entrance and gestured for her to stand still as he exchanged a few words with the other officers behind the desk. Lisa stood there, her hands trembling as she waited, her heart pounding with dread. She didn't know what they planned to do with her, where they were going to take her, or if anyone would ever listen to her side of the story. The officer returned to her side, and without a word, he began leading her toward the main entrance of the station. They passed through the heavy double doors and stepped out onto the concrete steps outside. The cool evening air hit her like a slap, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside the station. The street was quiet, save for the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional footsteps of pedestrians passing by. As they descended the steps, Lisa noticed a familiar figure standing near the bottom of the staircase. Her heart leapt as she recognized her father, his face tight with worry and anger. He looked up as they approached, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of his daughter in handcuffs, her cheeks tear-streaked, her wrists red and swollen from the cuffs. "Lisa," he called, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and fury. He strode forward, his gaze locked on the officers who held her. The officer's grip on her arm tightened as they stopped in front of her father. "Mr. Andreev, we were just bringing her to you. We've completed the paperwork and she'll be released to your custody. But we still have some questions about what happened." Mr. Andreev's jaw clenched as he looked from the officer to his daughter. He didn't say anything for a moment, but the fury in his eyes was unmistakable. His gaze shifted to Lisa, his face softening slightly as he reached out, pulling her into a hug. She collapsed against him, her small body trembling as he held her tightly, his hand gently stroking her hair. "It's okay, Lisa," he murmured, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and reassurance. "I'm here now. You're safe." Lisa felt the weight of her fear lift slightly as her father held her, but the relief was short-lived. She could still feel the eyes of the officers on them, could still sense the accusation in their gaze. Her father straightened, his arms still around her, and looked back at the officers with a steely determination. "I need an explanation," he said, his voice low and controlled but laced with anger. "Why was my daughter treated like this? She's a child. She hasn't done anything wrong." The officer cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Andreev, we were responding to a call. A complaint was made against her by an employee at your store. She claimed that your daughter was caught attempting to steal." Mr. Andreev's eyes narrowed, his voice dangerously calm. "My daughter does not steal," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And even if she had made a mistake, there is no reason for her to have been treated so harshly. I want to know why she was put in handcuffs, why she was humiliated and dragged to this station like a criminal." The officers exchanged glances, looking increasingly uncomfortable under his intense scrutiny. One of them shifted his weight, clearing his throat nervously. "We were just following protocol, sir. The complaint sounded credible, and we had to take action." Mr. Andreev's grip on Lisa tightened, his gaze never leaving the officer. "So, you just took her word for it? No questions asked, no investigation? You simply assumed my daughter was guilty because of the color of her skin." The officer's face reddened, and he glanced down, clearly at a loss for words. Lisa could feel the tension radiating from her father, his anger barely contained. She knew he was furious, not just at Miss Gray, but at the officers, at the entire system that had allowed this nightmare to unfold. The second officer stepped forward, his tone more conciliatory. "Mr. Andreev, we apologize if our actions seemed excessive. We were acting on the information we were given. Perhaps we could discuss this further at the station." Mr. Andreev's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "Fine, but I'm not leaving until I get answers." He glanced down at Lisa, his expression softening as he brushed a tear from her cheek. "Go wait in the car, sweetheart. I'll be there soon." Lisa nodded, her eyes wide with lingering fear. She walked slowly toward the car, glancing back once at the officers who stood uneasily under her father's intense gaze. She opened the door, climbed inside, and curled up in the back seat, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. As she sat there, the weight of the day settled over her, filling her with a profound sadness. She had always thought of the store as a place of safety, a place where she could lose herself in the beauty of the jewelry her father had created. But now, that sense of security had been shattered, replaced by a deep-rooted fear that clung to her like a shadow. Minutes passed as she waited, each one stretching out longer than the last. Finally, her father emerged from the station, his expression grim and his eyes dark with anger. He climbed into the car beside her, closing the door with a force that made her flinch. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice small and filled with uncertainty. Mr. Andreev looked over at her, his gaze softening slightly. "It's all right, Lisa. I spoke to them. They know they were wrong, and they're going to make sure this never happens again." Lisa nodded, but she could still feel the lingering doubt and fear twisting inside her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel safe again, but the memory of Miss Gray's accusations and the officer's cold treatment haunted her. She wasn't sure if things would ever go back to the way they were before. As they drove home, Lisa sat in silence, her mind replaying the events of the day. She could still hear Miss Gray's voice, the cruel words that had cut through her like a knife. She could still feel the weight of the officer's hands on her arms, the cold bite of the handcuffs, the stares of strangers as she was led away like a criminal. Her father glanced over at her, his face filled with worry. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Lisa, I want you to know that none of this was your fault. You did nothing wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're less than anyone else." Lisa looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the reassurance his words offered, but the pain and fear were too fresh, too real. She nodded, her lips pressed together as she struggled to keep her emotions in check. They drove the rest of the way in silence, the weight of the day settling over them both. Lisa knew that her father would do everything he could to protect her, to make sure she was safe. But as she stared out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something she couldn't put into words. When they arrived home, Lisa went straight to her room, curling up on her bed and hugging her knees to her chest. The events of the day played over and over in her mind, each memory a sharp reminder of the fear and humiliation she had endured. She didn't know how to make sense of it, didn't know how to feel safe again. Her father knocked gently on her door, entering the room and sitting beside her on the bed. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her close, his presence a comforting anchor in the midst of her confusion and pain. "Lisa," he said softly, "I'm going to make sure this never happens again. I'm going to talk to everyone involved and make them understand that they can't treat people like this." Lisa nodded, resting her head on his shoulder as she closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. She didn't know if things would ever be the same, didn't know if she would ever feel the same sense of safety she once had. But in that moment, with her father's arm around her, she felt a small spark of hope. As they sat together in the quiet of her room, Lisa knew that no matter what happened, she wasn't alone. She had her father, and together they would find a way to move forward, to heal from the wounds of the day, and build a future where she would never have to feel this fear again. As the first rays of morning light filtered through Lisa's window, she awoke with a lingering sense of dread. The events of the previous day were still fresh in her mind, a series of painful memories that she wished she could forget. Her cheek ached where Miss Gray had slapped her, and her wrists were still tender from the handcuffs that had cut into her skin. For the first time, her father's jewelry store no longer felt like a place of magic and wonder. It felt tarnished, shadowed by the cruel accusations and harsh treatment she had endured. When Lisa made her way downstairs, she found her father in the living room, his expression unreadable, but his eyes simmering with an intensity she had never seen before. He looked up as she entered, and his face softened for a brief moment as he took in her fragile, weary appearance. But beneath his concern, there was a barely contained anger, a quiet, burning fury that seemed to radiate from him. "Lisa," he said, his voice low and steady, but filled with determination, "we're going back to the store today. I'm not letting what happened yesterday go without consequences." Lisa felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. She wanted justice for what Miss Gray had done, for the way the police had treated her. But the idea of returning to that store, to the place where her nightmare had begun, made her stomach twist with anxiety. She nodded silently, her eyes downcast, and her father placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. The drive to the store was silent, tension filling the space between them. Lisa could sense her father's resolve, his fierce determination to confront the people who had wronged her. She sat quietly beside him, clutching her hands together in her lap, her heart pounding as they neared the store. She wondered what would happen, what her father planned to say, and whether anyone would finally listen. When they arrived, her father stepped out first, his presence strong and unyielding as he led Lisa into the store. The employees looked up as they entered, surprise and unease flickering across their faces. They recognized Mr. Andreev's anger, the controlled fury that hinted at a confrontation no one wanted to be part of. Lisa stayed close to her father, her small frame slightly hunched, her gaze fixed on the floor. Miss Gray was behind the counter, organizing a display with her usual air of self-importance. She glanced up, her expression changing from mild annoyance to one of feigned politeness as she saw Mr. Andreev. But when her gaze fell on Lisa, her eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation crossing her face. "Mr. Andreev," she greeted with a tight smile, trying to mask her surprise. "What a surprise to see you here this morning. Is there something I can help you with?" "Yes, there is," he replied, his voice sharp and laced with barely concealed anger. He moved closer, his gaze locked onto her with a fierce intensity that made her take an involuntary step back. "We need to discuss what happened yesterday. My daughter was falsely accused, humiliated, and assaulted under this roof, and I want answers." Miss Gray's face paled slightly, but she quickly recovered, forcing a calm expression. "Sir, I was simply doing my duty as an employee. Lisa was behaving suspiciously, and I had to act accordingly." "Suspiciously?" Mr. Andreev's voice was low, filled with a venomous edge that made everyone within earshot stop what they were doing. "My daughter was browsing her father's store, a place she's been visiting for years. She accidentally knocked over a piece of jewelry, and you decided that gave you the right to assault her, to treat her like a criminal?" Miss Gray's expression hardened, a trace of defiance flashing in her eyes. "Mr. Andreev, I have a responsibility to ensure the security of this store. It's nothing personal, but when I saw her behavior, I took the necessary steps to protect your inventory. Surely you understand that." Mr. Andreev's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his patience wearing thin. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerously low tone. "Nothing personal," he repeated, each word laced with a quiet fury. "You slapped my daughter across the face. You called the police, dragged her through humiliation, all because of a simple accident." Miss Gray's composure faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly forced herself to regain her indifferent demeanor. "I had no choice. Her behavior was suspicious, and I acted on what I thought was best." "Thought?" His voice was barely a whisper now, cold and sharp. "What gave you the right to assume the worst about her? Did you even stop to consider that she was innocent, that she was just a child?" Miss Gray's gaze flickered, her expression wavering under his scrutiny. "I was only trying to protect the store. I didn't know she was your daughter." The last words slipped out, and as they did, her voice trailed off. It was as if she realized, too late, the implications of what she had just said. Her face paled and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Mr. Andreev's jaw tightened, his face filled with a mixture of anger and disgust. "So, if it had been any other little girl, you'd have done the same? You'd have called the police, assaulted her, humiliated her, all because you didn't think she belonged here?" Miss Gray stammered, her confidence fading as the weight of her actions pressed down on her. "Mr. Andreev, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what?" he interrupted, his voice filled with a raw intensity that silenced the entire store. "You didn't mean to treat her like a criminal, to judge her without a shred of evidence, to make her feel like she was worth less than the jewelry on these shelves." Miss Gray had no response. Her composure had shattered, and she looked around, as though searching for support from her fellow employees. But they stood silent, their faces a mixture of discomfort and disapproval. Lisa watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding as she saw her father stand up for her with a fierce determination she had never witnessed before. She felt a surge of relief, a sense of validation that made her want to cry. After all the humiliation, after feeling so powerless, her father's words gave her a glimmer of hope, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Mr. Andreev took a steadying breath, his voice softening slightly as he turned to address everyone in the store. "Listen closely," he said, his tone firm and commanding. "This store represents my family, my values, and I will not allow anyone, especially someone in my employment, to mistreat my daughter or anyone else. Effective immediately, Miss Gray, you are fired." The words hung in the air, and for a moment there was a stunned silence. Miss Gray's face turned pale, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form a response. She glanced around, but the other employees avoided her gaze, clearly unwilling to come to her defense. "Mr. Andreev, please," she stammered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "I was only doing my job. Surely you can't be serious." "I'm very serious," he replied, his tone final and unyielding. "Pack your things and leave. I don't tolerate cruelty, and I certainly don't tolerate prejudice in my store." Miss Gray hesitated, a flicker of resentment in her eyes, but the authority in his voice left no room for argument. She gathered her belongings, her face flushed with shame as she made her way toward the door. The other employees watched her go, their expressions a mixture of relief and approval. No one spoke a word, but the silence itself seemed to carry the weight of their disapproval. Lisa watched as Miss Gray disappeared through the door, a strange sense of relief flooding her chest. The woman who had caused her so much pain, who had treated her with such cruelty, was finally gone. But the memory of what had happened, of the fear and humiliation she had endured, still lingered. Her father turned to her, his face softening as he knelt down beside her. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. Lisa nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes. Thank you, Daddy." He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a comforting embrace. She buried her face in his shoulder, letting the tears fall as the weight of the past day finally lifted, leaving her with a sense of peace she hadn't felt since the ordeal began. But as he held her, Mr. Andreev's face darkened. He knew that Miss Gray's actions were only part of the problem. The police officers who had arrived and treated his daughter like a criminal, who had ignored her pleas and humiliated her, were just as much to blame. The anger that had fueled him throughout the morning still burned within him, and he knew that he couldn't let it go unchallenged. He pulled back slightly, looking into Lisa's eyes with a determination that was both fierce and protective. "We're not done yet," he said softly. "The police, what they did to you was wrong. They should have protected you, not treated you like that. I'm going to make sure they answer for it." Lisa's heart swelled with a mixture of fear and hope. She knew her father was determined, that he would fight for her, but the memory of the officer's cold, unfeeling treatment still haunted her. She didn't want to relive it, didn't want to think about it, but she trusted her father and she knew he would do whatever it took to make things right. Together, they left the store, stepping out into the bright morning sunlight. The weight of what had happened still hung over them, but for the first time, Lisa felt a spark of hope. She knew that her father wouldn't let her down, that he would stand by her no matter what. As they walked away, the determination in her father's step reassured her. They weren't finished, but she knew that together they could face whatever came next. The city's police station was an intimidating building of gray concrete and harsh lines, an impersonal place that seemed to absorb warmth and compassion from everyone who entered. But that did nothing to weaken Mr. Andreev's resolve. Holding Lisa's hand firmly in his, he strode through the glass doors with a steely determination. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the rows of desks, the officers going about their business, and the serious faces of the public waiting to speak with someone in charge. Lisa's grip on her father's hand tightened as they approached the front desk. She didn't want to be here. Just the sight of the police station made her heart pound with fear. But the warmth and firmness of her father's hand gave her courage. She reminded herself that he was here with her, that he was going to make sure someone listened to them this time. A woman in a police uniform looked up from behind the desk, her expression polite but distant. "Can I help you?" she asked, glancing between Mr. Andreev and Lisa with a slight hint of curiosity. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady but carrying a weight of authority that left no room for dismissal. "I need to speak to whoever is in charge regarding an incident that happened with my daughter yesterday. I expect someone to address it immediately." The officer raised her eyebrows, momentarily taken aback by his tone, but she quickly recovered. "If you'd like to file a formal complaint, you'll need to speak with Lieutenant Carter. Please have a seat, and I'll let him know you're here." Mr. Andreev nodded curtly, and they made their way to the waiting area. Lisa sank into one of the hard plastic chairs, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. The memory of being handcuffed and led through these very doors the previous day haunted her, and the curious glances from officers walking by only heightened her discomfort. Her father placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, Lisa," he whispered. "We're going to make sure they hear us. No one should have to go through what you did." After a few tense minutes, a tall man with a serious face and sharp eyes approached them. He wore a police uniform, but there was a badge on his chest that marked him as a lieutenant. He extended a hand toward Mr. Andreev, his expression guarded but respectful. "Mr. Andreev, I'm Lieutenant Carter. I understand you have some concerns regarding an incident involving your daughter." "Yes," he replied, standing up and shaking the lieutenant's hand with a firm grip. "My daughter was falsely accused of theft, physically assaulted, and taken into custody without any investigation or consideration. I want to know why this happened and what your department intends to do about it." Lieutenant Carter's expression grew more serious, and he gestured toward an empty meeting room down the hall. "Let's discuss this in private. I'd like to hear your account of what happened." Once they were seated in the room, Lieutenant Carter pulled out a notebook and a pen, looking at Lisa with a gaze that was softer than she expected. "Lisa, can you tell me what happened yesterday?" Lisa hesitated, glancing at her father for reassurance. He nodded, giving her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder, and she took a shaky breath before beginning. I was just looking at the jewelry in my dad's store," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I accidentally knocked an earring off a stand, and before I could pick it up, Miss Gray, one of the salespeople, saw me. She started yelling at me, and she slapped me. She said I was trying to steal, but I wasn't." Her voice broke, and she felt tears prick at her eyes, the memory of that slap still raw and painful. She looked down, not wanting to meet Lieutenant Carter's gaze, afraid he wouldn't believe her, just like the others. "She called the police," Mr. Andreev continued, his voice cold and controlled. "Your officers arrived and immediately treated my daughter as if she were guilty. They put her in handcuffs, dragged her out of the store in front of everyone, and brought her here without even listening to her side of the story." Lieutenant Carter's expression grew increasingly serious as he listened, and he scribbled notes in his notebook. "And you're saying that there was no attempt to verify the situation? No one spoke to your daughter about what happened?" "Exactly," Mr. Andreev replied, his voice tense. "Your officers took the word of an employee who clearly had her own prejudices, without any questions or consideration for my daughter's innocence. This was nothing less than an act of racial profiling, and I want accountability from everyone involved." The lieutenant nodded, his face thoughtful. He set down his pen and looked back at Mr. Andreev and Lisa, his expression somber. "Mr. Andreev, I understand your frustration, and I assure you, this department takes complaints of this nature very seriously. What you're describing is unacceptable, and we'll investigate this matter thoroughly." Lisa's heart lifted slightly. She hadn't expected anyone to actually take them seriously, but the lieutenant's tone and expression seemed sincere. It was the first glimmer of hope she had felt since the nightmare had begun. "Will the officers involved face consequences?" her father asked, his voice steady and demanding. "I don't want empty promises, Lieutenant. I want action." Lieutenant Carter nodded. "We'll conduct a full review, including examining any body camera footage from the officers. If we find that there was a mishandling of the situation or that protocol was violated, there will be consequences. I give you my word on that." The weight of his words filled the room, and for a moment there was only silence. Lisa could feel her father's anger simmering beside her, but there was also a sense of relief, a sense that finally someone was willing to listen. Lieutenant Carter turned to Lisa, his gaze softening. "Lisa, I'm truly sorry for what you went through. No one should ever be made to feel the way you did, especially not a child. I promise you, we'll do everything we can to make this right." Lisa nodded, her voice barely a whisper as she replied, "Thank you." As they left the station, Lisa felt lighter than she had in days. She knew that there was still a long way to go, that the scars from the ordeal would not heal overnight, but she felt a flicker of hope, a hope that things might finally change, that justice might finally be served. Her father walked beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, his expression both resolute and proud. "Daddy," she said softly as they reached the car, "do you think they'll really do something about it?" Her father looked down at her, his face filled with a fierce determination. "Yes, Lisa, I do. And if they don't, we'll make sure they do. No one gets to treat you that way." Lisa smiled, a small, tentative smile, and climbed into the car. As they drove home, she let herself hope that the people who had wronged her would finally face the consequences of their actions, and that maybe, just maybe, she would be able to find peace again. The courthouse loomed ahead, an imposing structure of stone and steel that seemed to rise out of the earth, stark against the morning sky. Lisa clutched her father's hand as they approached, her small fingers tightly wrapped around his, seeking comfort and strength. The memory of what had happened in the jewelry store was still fresh in her mind, a bruise that hadn't yet faded. But her father's determined presence by her side gave her hope, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight for justice. Today was the beginning of Miss Gray's trial. After days of preparing statements, consulting with lawyers, and revisiting painful memories, Lisa and her father were here to make sure the truth would finally be heard. Mr. Andreev had been relentless in his pursuit of justice, insisting that not only Miss Gray, but also the police officers involved, face the consequences of their actions. The courtroom was filled with spectators, reporters, and officers from the police department, all waiting to hear what would unfold. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of expectation heavy as people exchanged murmurs and glances. Lisa stayed close to her father, feeling small and exposed among the strangers who filled the room. But as they took their seats near the front, she felt her father's steady grip on her hand, a silent reminder that he was there for her. Moments later, Miss Gray entered, flanked by her lawyer. She looked different. Her once haughty demeanor was gone, replaced by an expression of unease. She avoided looking at Lisa, keeping her gaze fixed on the floor, but Lisa could feel the weight of her presence, a reminder of the cruelty and humiliation she had inflicted. The judge entered, calling the court to order. Silence fell over the room as everyone settled in, waiting for the proceedings to begin. The prosecutor stood up first, addressing the jury and the crowd with a solemn tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are here today to address a grave injustice. A young girl, an innocent child, was falsely accused, assaulted, and humiliated by the defendant, Miss Gray. This is a case not only of physical assault, but of prejudice, of bias, and of a betrayal of trust." Lisa listened, her heart pounding as the prosecutor outlined the events that had led to this moment. His words echoed the pain she had felt, the sense of betrayal and disbelief that had haunted her since that day. She glanced at her father, who gave her a reassuring nod, his eyes filled with support and pride. The prosecutor continued, calling Lisa as the first witness. Her heart skipped a beat as she stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she approached the witness stand. She glanced out at the sea of faces before her, feeling vulnerable under their watchful eyes. But as she looked at her father, his steady presence gave her the courage to speak. The prosecutor asked her to recount what had happened that day in the store, and Lisa took a deep breath, forcing herself to remember each painful detail. She described how she had accidentally knocked over the earring, how Miss Gray had accused her of stealing, how she had tried to explain, but was met with cruelty and violence instead. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her words a raw testament to the fear and helplessness she had felt. When she described the moment Miss Gray had slapped her, a gasp went through the courtroom. Lisa's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she pressed on, determined to tell the whole truth. She recounted how Miss Gray had called the police, how the officers had arrived and treated her like a criminal without asking her side of the story. When she was finished, she looked up at the prosecutor, feeling both exhausted and relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The prosecutor gave her an encouraging smile, and she returned to her seat beside her father, who wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. Next, the prosecutor called the officers who had responded to the call that day. They walked to the witness stand, their expressions uneasy as they took their oaths. Lisa watched as they recounted their actions, their words carefully chosen, their faces unreadable. They admitted to following procedure, but the prosecutor was relentless, questioning their judgment, their lack of investigation, their failure to consider her innocence. "Is it standard procedure," the prosecutor asked pointedly, "to assume guilt based solely on a single person's accusation, without verifying the facts, without speaking to the accused?" One of the officers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner before responding. "No, sir. But given the nature of the call, we took action as we thought necessary." "And yet," the prosecutor pressed, "the necessary action was to put an 11-year-old girl in handcuffs to drag her through public humiliation without even asking her side of the story?" The officer's face reddened, and he struggled to respond, his words faltering under the prosecutor's scrutiny. We didn't mean for it to go that far." Lisa felt a strange sense of satisfaction as she watched the officers squirm under the prosecutor's questioning. For the first time, they were being held accountable, forced to confront the impact of their actions. The prosecution then presented the surveillance footage from the store, the recording showing every painful moment, the slap, the accusation, the rough treatment by the police. Lisa's heart raced as she watched the events unfold on the screen, reliving the humiliation and fear she had felt. The footage was a stark reminder of the truth, a powerful piece of evidence that left the courtroom in stunned silence. When the prosecution rested, Miss Gray's lawyer stood up, beginning his defense with a carefully crafted argument. He tried to paint Miss Gray as a responsible employee, claiming she had acted out of concern for the store's security, that she hadn't known Lisa was innocent. But the surveillance footage and the officers' testimonies left little room for doubt. His words rang hollow, a weak attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Miss Gray was called to testify, and Lisa felt a wave of anxiety as she watched the woman who had caused her so much pain take the stand. Miss Gray looked visibly nervous, her usual confidence shaken, her voice unsteady as she answered the questions posed to her. "Miss Gray," the prosecutor asked, his tone cold and direct, "why did you assume Lisa was stealing?" Miss Gray hesitated, glancing around the courtroom as if searching for an answer. She was acting suspiciously," she stammered, her gaze faltering. I thought she was trying to take the earring." "And did you consider, even for a moment, that you might be wrong?" the prosecutor pressed. "That maybe, just maybe, you had made a mistake?" Miss Gray's face flushed, and she looked down, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't think about that. I was just doing my job." The prosecutor's gaze hardened. "Your job involved physically assaulting an innocent child, calling the police, and treating her like a criminal. Do you believe that's acceptable behavior?" Miss Gray had no answer, her silence a stark admission of guilt. Finally, the judge called for closing statements. The prosecutor stood, addressing the jury with a powerful speech that resonated throughout the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and unwavering, "this case is about more than just one day, one incident. It's about the assumptions, the biases, and the prejudices that led to an innocent child being treated like a criminal. Lisa was a young girl in her own father's store, a place that should have been safe. But instead, she was humiliated, assaulted, and left with emotional scars that will take far longer to heal than any bruise." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the jury, his words carrying the weight of the injustice Lisa had endured. This is a moment to hold people accountable for their actions, to send a message that no one, especially a child, should ever be treated this way. I urge you to remember Lisa's story, to remember her courage in standing up and telling the truth, and to deliver a verdict that reflects the gravity of what happened. The jury deliberated, the courtroom filled with an anxious silence as everyone waited for the decision. Lisa sat beside her father, her heart pounding, her hand shaking as she clung to his arm. She wanted justice, but the fear of what the jury might decide gnawed at her, a reminder of all the pain she had endured. After what felt like an eternity, the jury returned, their faces solemn as they took their seats. The judge asked for their verdict, and the foreperson stood, clearing her throat before reading the decision. We find the defendant, Miss Gray, guilty of assault, child endangerment, and false reporting, she announced, her voice ringing out clearly. A collective sigh filled the courtroom, a wave of relief washing over Lisa as she heard the words she had been waiting for. Her father squeezed her hand, his expression filled with pride and triumph. Miss Gray's face paled, her once haughty expression replaced by one of shock and fear as she realized the consequences of her actions. The judge pronounced the sentence, ordering Miss Gray to serve time in prison and pay restitution. Lisa watched as Miss Gray was led away, a sense of closure filling her heart. Justice had been served, the truth had been recognized, and those who had wronged her were finally facing the consequences. As they left the courtroom, her father wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You were so brave, Lisa," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Lisa looked up at him, a smile breaking through the lingering sadness in her eyes. "Thank you, Daddy, for believing in me." They stepped outside into the warm sunlight, leaving the weight of the courtroom behind. Lisa felt a sense of peace, a feeling that the worst was finally over. She had stood up for herself, had faced her fears, and had found justice. And with her father by her side, she knew she would always have the strength to keep moving forward, no matter what. As Lisa and her father stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of the past few days began to lift. The sunlight felt warm against her skin, and for the first time since the ordeal had started, she could breathe without the tight knot of fear in her chest. She looked up at her father, who gave her a reassuring smile, his expression filled with pride and relief. They walked together, their steps steady and filled with purpose. They had faced something dark and painful, but justice had been served. Miss Gray would face the consequences of her actions, and the police officers involved were now under investigation, a process her father would ensure stayed fair and transparent. Later that evening, back in the comfort of their home, Lisa sat quietly at the kitchen table while her father prepared dinner. The familiar sounds of chopping and sizzling filled the air, grounding her and bringing a sense of normalcy she hadn't realized she missed. Her father placed a warm bowl of soup in front of her and took a seat across the table, his face softened by the glow of the kitchen lights. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" he asked gently, studying her with concern. Lisa nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm bowl. "I think so, Daddy," she said softly. "I'm just glad it's over." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I know it was hard, but you were incredibly brave. You didn't let them silence you, and because of that, things are going to change. Not just for you, but for others too." Lisa felt a small, hopeful smile forming on her lips. She thought of the courthouse, of the people who had listened to her story, who had acknowledged the truth. The fear and humiliation still lingered, but now there was something else, a strength she hadn't known she had. "Thank you, Daddy," she said, her voice steady, "for believing in me and for fighting with me." Her father smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "Always, Lisa. I'll always be here for you." As they sat together, a sense of peace settled over them. The memories of what had happened would take time to heal, but Lisa knew she would be okay. She had her father, and with his support, she could face anything. Together, they would move forward, leaving the shadows of the past behind and stepping into a future filled with strength and hope. As Lisa and her father walked out of the courthouse, they felt the weight of their battle finally lifting. Justice had been served, and Miss Gray was held accountable for her actions. Lisa knew the scars would take time to heal, but with her father by her side, she felt stronger, ready to move forward. This story isn't just about Lisa. It's about standing up against injustice, no matter how young or small you feel. What would you do if this was your child? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Remember, your support helps us bring these important issues to light.